Hey guys, welcome back. And if you're new here, glad you found us. Today we're diving into something a little different, but incredibly eye-opening. It's a journey through the everyday lives of people history often forgets figures like Roman prostitutes, Viking healers, medieval bakers, and one teenage girl who defied kings and churches to become a saint, Joan of Arc. These aren't just side characters in the grand story of empires and wars. They were real people whose work, struggles, and beliefs shaped their worlds in ways we're only beginning to fully understand. From the cramped brothels of ancient Rome to the smoky hearths of Viking longhouses, from battlefield visions to the scent of bread in pre-dawn medieval towns, we're exploring how survival, faith, power, and food were lived by those history didn't always write down in gold. So grab a seat, maybe a snack, and let's uncover the stories that truly built the past from the ground up. This video offers a vivid, multidisciplinary journey through the overlooked, yet deeply human aspects of pre-modern life across several historical periods and cultures. Drawing from meticulous historical research, the documentary sheds light on the lives of individuals often relegated to the margins of conventional narratives: Roman prostitutes, Viking healers, the visionary figure of Joan of Arc, and medieval bakers. Each segment stands as a richly detailed vignette, not only recounting the historical facts, but immersing viewers in the daily realities, beliefs, and survival strategies of people navigating the complex social fabrics of their times. Opening in the teeming streets of imperial Rome, the documentary explores the fraught existence of Roman prostitutes women, caught between societal disdain and economic necessity. Through an examination of their working conditions, taxation burdens, and even the unique symbolism of their attire, the segment reveals how these women employed resilience, ingenuity, and resourcefulness to navigate a world that offered them few protections. The narrative then travels northward into the realm of Viking Age Scandinavia, where the seemingly mystical world of herbal medicine takes center stage. Here, the role of women as healers and seeresses is foregrounded, illuminating a tradition where botanical knowledge and Norse spirituality intertwined, with plants like yarrow, juniper, and meadowsweet doubling as both remedy and ritual. Viking healing emerges as a holistic response to the demands of a physically arduous and spiritually rich warrior culture, transitioning into the heart of medieval France. The focus shifts to one of the most iconic figures in European history, Joan of Arc, against the backdrop of the 100 Years' War. The documentary recounts her improbable rise from rural obscurity to military leadership and sainthood. Through her visions, campaigns, and trial, Joan's story is framed not only as a chronicle of martyrdom, but also as a study in charisma, conviction, and the enduring power of national myth. Finally, the documentary turns to the hearth and oven of the medieval baker. Often working under intense physical strain and strict legal scrutiny, bakers occupied a pivotal role in maintaining food security and social order. The segment explores everything from the sourdough fermentation process to the intricate hierarchy of bread types dictated by class and religion. It also pays special attention to the gender dynamics of baking and the guild systems that regulated the trade, offering a window into the communal and symbolic life of bread in the medieval world. Together, these four narratives form a cohesive tapestry of historical insight, drawing attention to the textured, everyday lives of those often obscured by the grand sweep of kings, empires, and wars. Far from footnotes in the historical record, Roman sex workers, Viking herbalists, peasant turns saints, and flour-dusted bakers emerge as essential contributors to their cultures, resilient, complex, and deeply human. In the shadowed corners of ancient Rome, beneath the grandeur of marble forums and sprawling villas, lay a reality few cared to acknowledge: a world cramped, dim, and defined by its invisibility. Here, in spaces scarcely larger than storage closets, Roman prostitutes lived and labored in a city that viewed them as both necessary and morally corrupt. a contradiction that shaped every aspect of their daily existence. These women, who plied their trade in the gritty substructure of one of history's most powerful empires, were not merely working in brothels or rented rooms above noisy taverns. They were surviving in spaces that actively denied them dignity. Their quarters little more than cubicles built into the walls of insulae, or apartment blocks lacked ventilation, natural light, privacy, or even basic sanitation. Cramped together in these suffocating rooms with fellow workers, clients, and the ever-present hum of city life. They lived on the margins not just in status but in space, confined to physical environments that mirrored their social exclusion. The brothels, often called lupanaria, from lupa, the Latin word for chevalf, a common euphemism for a prostitute, were intentionally constructed to be hidden away, tucked into the backs of alleyways or integrated into the lower levels of inns, bathhouses, and drinking halls. These were places of perpetual shadow and unrelenting noise, where the division between home and workspace dissolved completely, and where the omnipresence of commerce rendered personal boundaries meaningless. A woman might sleep in the same bed where she entertained clients, wash herself in a shared bucket passed between workers, or eat in the very hallway where men waited their turn. The lack of a stable, private domestic sphere stripped these women of a fundamental Roman ideal, the sanctity of the household. In Roman society, domus to home was more than just a physical structure. It was the seat of honor, legacy, and familial piety. To be denied a proper home was to be denied Roman identity itself. This spatial disenfranchisement was not accidental. It was deeply entangled with the cultural and legal mechanisms that kept sex workers in a state of perpetual outsiderhood. They could not legally marry Roman citizens, were excluded from respectable burial rites, and had no protections under Roman pudicitia, the ideal of feminine modesty. Their living quarters reflected this moral outcasting. To the Roman elite, they were not just impure, but polluting. Even their location within the urban landscape spoke volumes. Brothels were often situated near the Subura, a densely packed lower-class neighborhood infamous for its crime and chaos, or near gladiator schools, taverns, and other institutions considered disreputable. The walls of these establishments were frequently scrawled with crude graffiti advertisements for specific women, prices for services, boasts from satisfied clients, transforming the buildings themselves into flesh-bound billboards. In many cases, the women themselves authored this graffiti, using it as a defiant form of marketing and identity in a society that otherwise rendered them anonymous. In a brutal paradox, this form of self-promotion was often their only claim to voice in the public sphere. Yet even in these dire conditions, the women displayed remarkable resilience and agency. Despite the constant surveillance and risk of exploitation, they developed coded systems of communication, formed informal networks of mutual support, and even engaged in acts of subtle resistance. Some women bartered for better quarters, bribed brothel keepers for protection, or cultivated repeat clients to secure a modicum of stability. A few managed to save enough money to buy their freedom or retire to quieter lives, though such outcomes were rare and hard-won. Their hygiene practices, too, deserve closer attention, not out of prurient interest, but because they reveal a form of self-care and professionalism amid adversity. Using oils, perfumes, and rudimentary cleansing rituals, these women navigated the fine line between commodified allure and practical health, all while warding off the constant threat of disease. In this way, their bodies became not only instruments of labor, but battlegrounds of survival, bearing the marks of both labor and trauma in a city that refused to acknowledge the humanity behind the transaction. Religion and superstition often filled the gaps left by legal and medical neglect. Many prostitutes kept amulets, prayed to fertility goddesses like Venus or Bona Dea, or participated in rituals meant to ward off ill luck and venereal afflictions. These beliefs, inherited from both Roman tradition and local syncretic cults, offered psychological refuge in a world that otherwise left them exposed to constant harm, physical, emotional, and social. And yet, for all their ingenuity and strength, their lives remained subject to the whims of a system designed to consume and discard them. The Roman state, recognizing the ubiquity of prostitution, chose not to abolish it, but to tax it, profiting from the very people it refused to protect. Sex workers were registered, monitored, and taxed under Augustus's reforms. Their names entered into official ledgers as a form of civic compliance, even as their humanity was erased from moral discourse. In a cruel twist of institutional irony, they were made visible to the state only through bureaucracy, not compassion. This calculated visibility in records, but not in rights, reinforced their status as economic instruments rather than social beings. The irony deepened when one considers the architecture of Rome itself. Grand public baths, basilicas, and triumphal arches proclaimed the glory of Roman civilization. Yet nestled within these same urban grids were the hidden worlds of its most vulnerable citizens. The grandeur of empire rested, quite literally, atop the shoulders of the forgotten. When historians and archaeologists examine the remnants of these brothels, whether in Pompeii, Ostia, or the capital itself, they often marvel at the preserved frescoes and inscribed walls. Yet the narrowness of the rooms, the absence of ventilation shafts, and the traces of wear etched into stone beds tell a story no less important. They speak of a life confined and surveilled, of commerce without rest, of agency exercised under constraint. These spaces are not merely archaeological curiosities. They are testament to the lived experience of marginalization, a physical record of Rome's systemic devaluation of certain lives. In the end, the brothel room was more than a place of business. It was a symbol of exclusion, of economic desperation, of resilience in the face of erasure. In these darkened rooms, history's silent majority labored not only for coin, but for survival, crafting meaning, identity, and connection in a world that offered little more than contempt. To understand Roman prostitution is not merely to explore a facet of ancient vice or commerce. It is to confront the layered architecture of marginality, where space, law, and custom conspired to create a life lived always at the edge of legality, of morality, and of social memory. These women, whose names are mostly lost to time, nonetheless left behind a legacy of endurance. Their lives contained within 4 stone walls, and yet so much larger than the confines imposed upon them, remind us that history is not only made in marble halls or senate chambers. It is also etched into the dust of alleyways, whispered between neighbors, scribbled on plaster in desperate advertisement, and lived out in the flickering candlelight of forgotten rooms. Their stories demand remembrance, not for spectacle, but for the insight they offer into a civilization as complex, hierarchical, and morally conflicted as any that has ever existed. And in that remembrance, we are asked not only to witness their marginalization, but to reckon with the enduring human capacity to endure, adapt, and assert worth in spaces designed to erase it. In the great mosaic of Roman society's hierarchies, laws, and customs, few symbols so starkly conveyed exclusion and identity as the clothing worn by its women. And among those garments, none bore heavier symbolic weight than the so-called female toga. This article of clothing, visually striking and legally imposed, was not a fashion choice, nor a token of status, but a mandatory signifier that marked a woman as belonging to the class of the dishonored, specifically prostitutes. At first glance, the toga is quintessentially Roman, a garment of draped dignity, typically associated with male citizenship, political life, and masculine virtue. In its traditional form, it was worn by senators, magistrates, and other public figures, a textile embodiment of Roman ideals. But when placed upon the shoulders of a woman specifically, a woman designated by law as a meretrix or sex worker, inverted those ideals completely. It became not a badge of honor, but a visible brand of disgrace. In this compulsory inversion, the female toga functioned as both a uniform and a warning, a powerful device of social control that simultaneously exposed and confined the wearer. It was legally enforced visibility, the act of making the profession of prostitution unmistakable to the Roman eye. Stripping the wearer of any pretense of pudicitia modesty, chastity, and feminine virtue, the very qualities Roman women were expected to embody. To don the toga was to step outside the moral and legal boundaries of respectable womanhood, and crucially, to be seen doing so. The state's insistence on this visual marker reveals much about how the Roman world constructed identity not just through words and actions, but through appearance, costume, and spatial presence. In a culture so deeply invested in visual symbolism, where even hairstyles and sandals could denote class and status, the female toga was not merely cloth. It was legislation in textile form. It was worn not by choice, but by mandata fabric of surveillance, stitched with the needle of law. Through its folds, one could read a woman's legal status, her moral condemnation, and her economic necessity. The garment made her visible to the public, but invisible to the protections of Roman family and social law. She was seen, yet erased, heard, yet never listened to. Her body became both sign and commodity, with her clothing acting as an advertisement to potential clients and a repellent to polite society. The fact that this garment was adapted from male attire rather than a degraded form of the stola, the traditional dress of Roman matrons, speaks volumes. In Roman thought, the stola symbolized domestic virtue and feminine passivity worn by legally married women of high standing. It was the visual shorthand for a woman's honor, her integration into a domus household, and her submission to male authority under Manus legal control. To be removed from the stola and placed in the toga was not only to lose one's respectability, was to lose one's place in the ideal Roman family altogether. And yet, the irony of this enforced attire is that, in many ways, it allowed women to survive within a system that marginalized them. The toga, stigmatizing as it was, functioned as a form of branding that made economic survival possible. Served as an immediately recognizable indicator of profession, eliminating ambiguity and allowing women to operate with a paradoxical kind of legitimacy. In the dense urban sprawl of Rome, with its chaotic streets and ever-churning marketplace of bodies, labor, and goods, this visibility allowed sex workers to signal their availability, to differentiate themselves from unmarked women, and to attract clients while avoiding legal trouble. In this way, the toga became both a cage and a shield. It protected the wearer from accusations of deception, something that could carry severe consequences in a society obsessed with reputation and legal categorization, while also fencing her off from the benefits of mainstream social identity. The wearing of the toga imposed a performative role, one that could not be removed at the end of the working day. Unlike modern professions, where uniforms may be shed after hours, the Roman prostitute wore her identity perpetually. The very cloth made her a public object, a walking advertisement, and an embodiment of the state's moral judgments. That the toga had to be worn at all times when in public reinforced this perpetual performance of shame and availability. In a legal and cultural environment where women were generally discouraged from even appearing in public without a male escort, the prostitute in her toga was doubly transgressive. She was both publicly present and marked as sexually autonomous. This dual transgression did not liberate her, but instead locked her into a specific, state-sanctioned role. She was outside the moral community, but still within the economic one. Condemned yet taxed, shamed yet tolerated. Her visibility ensured that the male-dominated state could control not only her body, but her presence, her reputation, and even the very way she was perceived by others. Furthermore, the toga symbolism extended beyond its wearer, reinforcing societal boundaries for all Roman women. It operated as a cautionary tela fabric of fear. Respectable women, cloaked in the stola, were constantly reminded that their virtue was not inherent, but performative and precarious. A step outside the bounds of acceptable behavior, or an accusation, true or false, could condemn them to the same fabric of shame. Indeed, Roman law occasionally compelled certain women to wear the toga as punishment, particularly in cases of adultery or moral scandal. Thus, the toga functioned as a sartorial threat, a permanent warning that womanhood in Rome was conditional and monitored, a status granted only so long as it was properly displayed and performed. The female toga also challenges modern assumptions about Roman fashion and gender norms. In contemporary imagination, Roman women are often romanticized as clad in flowing white robes, passive figures in the background of masculine history. But the toga reminds us that clothing in ancient Rome was an active force, a weapon, a sentence, a livelihood. The gendered use of the toga destabilizes our understanding of femininity in antiquity by placing women in male-coded garments. The state was not empowering them, but stripping them of their appropriate gender role. They were being masculinized not as a means of equality, but as a method of exclusion, cast into a liminal space that was neither fully female in virtue nor male in honor. This visual regendering through clothing reflects broader anxieties in Roman society about female sexuality and social order. Sex workers, especially those who were legally registered as maritresses, occupied a unique legal class. They were not slaves, though many had once been, but neither were they full citizens. They could earn money, own property, and even save for manumission or retirement. But they could not marry into citizen families or claim the protections afforded to good women. The toga solidified this boundary visually and psychologically, creating a clear distinction between those who participated in Roman virtue and those who lived outside it. And yet, despite its oppressive intent, the female toga was not entirely without agency. In the same way that modern marginalized groups have often reclaimed stigmatized symbols, some Roman sex workers seem to have embraced the toga as a tool of visibility and branding. Graffiti in Pompeii and other cities show sex workers advertising their services by name, price, and sometimes even specialty, accompanied by sketches of togate figures in provocative poses. Whether these images represent actual self-expression or marketing imposed by brothel owners is unclear, but they suggest that the visual markers of the trade were known and potentially used strategically. In a world where verbal contracts were difficult to enforce and reputation carried legal weight, the toga functioned as a kind of certification. It told potential clients, "This woman is legally permitted to sell sex. You may engage her services," without fear of legal repercussion. This clarity, while born of exclusion, also enabled a kind of protection within the economic system. To be seen was to be validated, if only in the narrow transactional terms allowed by Roman law. Thus, the toga carried a paradoxical power. It was at once a tool of oppression and a means of survival, a symbol of condemnation and a sign of economic legitimacy. It was woven from the very contradictions of Roman society, where morality and commerce were constantly in tension, and where visibility could both empower and destroy. That such a small piece of cloth could carry so much meaning as a testament to the central role clothing played in Roman life, not just as personal adornment, but as legal document, social signal, and psychological weapon. In the story of the female toga, we glimpse the broader workings of Roman civilization, its obsession with classification, its deep anxieties about gender and sexuality, its capacity for both cruelty and complexity. We also see the resilience of the women who, cloaked in shame, nevertheless found ways to navigate a system stacked against them. They lived under surveillance, yet carved out identities. They were branded, yet not broken. The toga made them public, but not silent. Through this garment, we confront a world in which fabric was law. Appearance was destiny, and the simple act of getting dressed became a negotiation with power. As we peer into the shadows of history, the figure of the togate woman reminds us that visibility is never neutral. It can expose, illuminate, punish, and protect, but it always reveals the values of the society that demands it. And in Rome, what it revealed was a world where womanhood was policed by fabric, where freedom and stigma were stitched together, and where even the threads of a garment told stories of survival, strategy, and the indelible marks of being seen. In the dust-choked alleyways of ancient Pompeii, long before the first printed flyer or flickering neon sign, before search engines optimized visibility or five-star reviews influenced consumer trust, a different kind of marketing was etched into crumbling walls and faded plaster, a language of commerce and desire inscribed in the raw, blunt vernacular of the street. Graffiti, scrawled by hand with crude styluses or scratched with sharpened nails, peppered the facades of brothels, taverns, bathhouses, and alley walls, offering a fascinating window into the earliest iterations of what we now recognize as advertising, branding, and reputation management. In the red light districts of this Roman city, particularly in the Lupanar, the largest surviving brothel in Pompeii, graffiti was more than idle vandalism or lewd amusement. It was a vibrant and competitive system of communication between sex workers, their clients, and the wider urban population. These inscriptions, preserved by the catastrophic eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE, provide one of the most vivid records of ancient consumer culture and illuminate how prostitutes in the Roman world, far from being passive victims of exploitation, actively participated in crafting their public image, managing their clientele, and navigating a highly competitive marketplace using the tools available to them: wit, reputation, and wall space. The parallels to the digital age are striking. Much like today's online platforms, where reviews, ratings, and user-generated content determine business visibility and perceived value. The prostitutes of Pompeii used graffiti as a means of feedback and marketing, creating an analog equivalent of Yelp or Google reviews, an unfiltered, often brutally honest chronicle of sexual commerce, performance, and preference. Graffiti served multiple functions. It allowed clients to boast, complain, or recommend. It enabled workers to advertise their names, specialties, and even prices. And it offered passersby a sense of what to expect in a particular establishment or with a specific individual. In a society with low literacy rates but high pedestrian traffic, the physical placement of graffiti mattered immensely. Strategic. Messages were etched at eye level near doorways, entryways, or corners where foot traffic was heaviest. Real estate for reputation carved into stone. One might find an inscription like Felix futuit bene. Felix had a good time, scrawled near a chamber door, serving as a public endorsement of a prostitute's services. Elsewhere, a more sardonic client might leave. Maritimus left unsatisfied, a Roman version of a one-star rating. Prostitutes themselves responded in kind, not just passively accepting public perception, but shaping it. Some graffitied their own names with flair. Myrtus delights all who visit or emphasize their desirability, experience, or unique talents such as oral sex, role play, or multilingual flirtation, catering to a cosmopolitan clientele in a bustling port city. Others advertised prices or referenced repeat customers, subtly emphasizing trustworthiness and satisfaction. Some of these messages were boastful, humorous, even poetic, revealing a culture of brash self-promotion and competitive flair. These inscriptions weren't private diary entries or secret codes. They were loud, public declarations in a world that thrived on spectacle. In a way, the walls of Pompeii functioned as living, breathing social media feeds, ways evolving, hyperlocal, and brutally candid. But unlike the curated and sanitized reviews of today, ancient graffiti carried an immediacy and permanence that made reputation both powerful and precarious. There was no recourse for negative feedback, no customer service email to lodge a complaint, no delete button. A scathing comment scratched into plaster could linger for years, visible to every potential client and competitor, shaping a sex worker's fortunes long after the original encounter. This created a high-stakes environment where reputation was currency and graffiti was the ledger. For prostitutes, this meant constant vigilance and performance, only of their services, but of their public image. Yet within this system of performative commerce, there was also space for play, identity, and voice. The very act of writing, especially for women often assumed to be illiterate, represents a form of agency rarely acknowledged in Roman historiography. Even if many prostitutes dictated their messages to literate scribes or brothel staff, the presence of self-referential graffiti, like Sabina writes this herself, suggests a conscious effort to claim authorship and voice in a society that systematically denied them both. Whether boasting of lovers, naming favorites, or poking fun at rivals, these women weren't just subjects of male commentary. They were speaking back, inscribing themselves into the very walls that confined them. Some inscriptions even transcend their commercial function, veering into the poetic or philosophical, musing on love, betrayal, or the fleeting nature of pleasure. One famously reads, "Weep, you girls. My beloved left me and took his heart. Oh, that I could die." A dramatic lament that might easily belong in a romantic novel or pop song, and yet is scratched into the wall of a brothel, blurring the lines between transaction and emotion, branding and confession. The interplay of voices, worker, client, competitor creates a chorus of urban life, a mosaic of human interaction that challenges modern assumptions about silence, shame, and agency in the ancient sex trade. Far from operating in anonymity or secrecy, Roman prostitutes engaged in a robust, open, and public negotiation of their value. In doing so, they reveal the contours of a society that, while deeply hierarchical and patriarchal, was also intensely commercial, performative, and saturated with visual messaging. This graffiti also sheds light on how the sex trade functioned within broader Roman consumer culture. Just as shops marked prices on goods and taverns displayed menus, brothels relied on branding and word-of-mouth literal words on walls to stay competitive. Customers became co-authors in a kind of feedback loop, their satisfaction or dissatisfaction feeding directly into the reputational economy of the trade. And unlike modern commercial spaces, where advertising is regulated and reputation curated, the brothels of Pompeii operated in a raw, unfiltered marketplace of the senses, where walls shouted rather than whispered. Even the spatial design of brothels supported this system. Rooms were small and uniform, with doors opening directly into narrow hallways or common areas, making the experience highly visible and communal. Graffiti enhanced this sense of public performance. Clients entered not just a transaction, but a theater of pleasure and status, where their names and acts might be immortalized in stone. Some inscriptions reference public figures or military ranks, such as Lucius, centurion of the 3rd cohort, was here and enjoyed Fortunata, turning personal encounters into public declarations of masculinity and virility. These boasts served dual purposes, reinforcing male identity within a culture obsessed with honor and simultaneously elevating the status of the prostitute named. If a powerful man frequented a particular worker, her value rose accordingly, kind of influencer marketing by association. In this way, graffiti operated not just as feedback, but as social proof, enhancing visibility, desirability, and economic value. The effectiveness of this system speaks to the entrepreneurial instincts of Roman sex workers, who understood that in a city teeming with options, visibility was survival. This marketing wasn't accidental, it was strategic. It turned walls into billboards, names into brands, and pleasure into performance. It allowed workers to build clientele, fend off competition, and even control aspects of their narrative, however limited that control may have been. And it reveals a sex economy that was far from disorganized or purely exploitative. Rather, it was structured, savvy, and deeply embedded in the rhythms of Roman urban life. Of course, this system also reveals the vulnerabilities inherent in public commerce. Just as a glowing review could boost business, a cruel or false inscription could ruin it. The lack of recourse or mediation meant that reputations were fragile and volatile, especially for workers with no legal protections. This precarity was compounded by the stigma attached to sex work already marginalized by law, religion, and custom. Prostitutes had to navigate an economy in which every transaction could be publicly recorded, judged, and remembered. Yet, within this fraught system, we see ingenuity, resilience, and even pride. The graffiti of Pompeii doesn't merely chronicle sex, it records survival, hustle, and the eternal human need to be seen, remembered, and valued. In this way, it speaks across millennia, offering modern audiences a glimpse of our own reflection in ancient stone. We, too, live in a world saturated with reviews, ratings, and branding. We, too, construct identities in public spaces, curate perception, and navigate visibility as both opportunity and risk. The sex workers of Pompeii, with their scratched names and sharp slogans, remind us that the dynamics of commerce, performance, and reputation are not inventions of the modern world, but deeply rooted in the human condition. Their graffiti is not just evidence of past lives, it is a testament to the continuity of entrepreneurial spirit, the universality of self-promotion, and the enduring complexity of labor in marginalized professions. When we walk through the narrow corridors of the Lupana, tracing our fingers over the same stone that once echoed with laughter, moans, and insults, we are not merely visiting a ruin. We are entering a conversation about sex and commerce, stigma and strategy, silence and speech. A conversation that began 2,000 years ago in the inkless language of walls, and that continues today in digital reviews, viral tweets, and every carefully worded bio on a screen. The tools may have changed, but the desire to be heard, chosen, and remembered remains the same. In the windswept landscapes of Viking-age Scandinavia, where icy fjords carved their way into rugged coastlines and dense pine forests whispered with ancestral memory, the practice of healing was not confined to salves, tinctures, or treatments, in the way modern biomedicine might define it. Rather, it was a rich, layered tapestry in which the physical, the spiritual, the magical, and the mythological were tightly interwoven, forming a worldview where health was never just a matter of the body alone, but always also of the soul, the gods, and the world tree Yggdrasil itself. In this cosmology, illness was not simply the result of pathogens or injury, it could be the consequence of angered spirits, broken oaths, malevolent seer magic, or disturbances in the delicate balance between human beings and the natural or supernatural realms. Healing, therefore, required more than the application of poultices or ingestion of herbal teas. Demanded ritual, invocation, the alignment of forces seen and unseen. It demanded understanding of plant lore, not merely as pharmacology, but as sacred practice. Plants such as mugwort, yarrow, angelica, juniper, meadowsweet, garlic, birch sap, match sap, and nettle were not viewed simply as ingredients in a healer's repertoire, but as living agents imbued with spiritual power, each resonating with its own symbolic frequency within the Norse cosmos. Mugwort, for instance, called liftjagrass in some sagas, was prized not only for its antispasmodic and menstrual regulating properties, but also as a protective charm, often burned to ward off spirits or carried in pouches by warriors and travelers for safe passage. In this context, to use mugwort was not only to treat cramps or stomach aches, but to fortify the self against the intrusion of harmful vitir spirits, to cleanse the aura and to commune with the unseen. Juniper, with its sharp scent and resilient growth, served a similar dual role. It was burned in longhouses to purify air and drive out illness, but also to sanctify a space, to clear it of dark magic or lingering negative energy, in much the same way modern rituals might use sage or incense. For Viking healers, known variously as Liknir, Vavlor Sirises, or Sikanor, female practitioners of magic, these plants were part of a broader cosmological system in which healing was a negotiation between humans and divine or elemental powers. The use of herbs was accompanied by chants, invocations, and ritual acts sometimes directed to deities such as Freya, Frigg, or Ire, a lesser-known goddess associated specifically with healing, or to land spirits tied to particular groves, rocks, or springs. These rites might include circle walking, rune carving, or even sacrificial offerings, linking the act of healing to the sacred rhythms of the cosmos. The practitioner did not merely apply a treatment, they performed a sacred duty, embodying the role of mediator between the seen and unseen, between flesh and fate. And because Norse cosmology emphasized the interconnection of all things humans, animals, gods, spirits, landforms, and plants, health itself was understood to be the outcome of harmony or disharmony within this web. A sick person had fallen out of sync with the rhythm of the world, and it was the healer's job to restore that alignment, using every tool available, herbal, magical, and divine. This stands in sharp contrast to modern biomedical models, which tend to isolate disease as an internal malfunction and focus on chemical or surgical intervention. While contemporary science emphasizes measurable outcomes and clinical trials, Viking herbal medicine depended on intuition, oral tradition, symbolic resonance, and spiritual rapport. Knowledge was not written in medical texts or standardized. Across regions, it was passed down through generations, primarily by women, in the form of remembered experience, ritualized practice, and mythic narrative. A healer might learn not just that yarrow stem helps to staunch bleeding, but that it must be harvested on a waxing moon, spoken to in a whisper, and never taken without a gift left in its place, be it a coin, a drop of blood, or a whispered thanks. These gestures were not superstition, but sacred etiquette, acknowledgments that the plant, like the person, possessed agency and deserved respect. This ethos of reciprocal relationship extended to the entire natural world, which was never inert or purely instrumental. Every stone, tree, and stream was alive with meaning and memory. A healing spring might owe its power to the residents of a Desira, protective ancestral spiritor to an ancient pact made between land and clan. To bathe in such a spring was not merely to cleanse the body, but to enter into communion with ancestral forces, to allow oneself to be restored not just chemically, but spiritually. This blurring of physical and metaphysical boundaries also defined the role of the healer. A skilled Liknir was not just a botanist, but a ritual specialist, a dream interpreter, a singer of Galdr sacred chants, and often a liminal figure, someone who existed slightly outside the community, feared and revered in equal measure. The healer might be consulted in cases of disease, infertility, madness, or cursed luck, and was expected to diagnose not just the symptom, but its underlying spiritual cause. Was the ailment due to a broken taboo, an insult to a household god, a curse cast by a rival? The healer's job was to divine the root of disorder and prescribe a path to balance. This holistic perspective was not merely mystical, but pragmatic. In a world where formal medicine barely existed, and where travel, battle, childbirth, and seasonal starvation were constant threats, survival depended on comprehensive care of the body, yes, but also of the mind, the spirit, and the community. Viking herbal medicine thus functioned as both a science and a social art, capable of treating wounds, calming spirits, resolving conflicts, and reinforcing cosmological truths. It reinforced the belief that healing was not a personal endeavor, but a communal and cosmic one, inextricably tied to one's place in the great mythic order. Even the language used to describe illness and healing reflects this worldview. Words like many trouble or affliction and laws in loosening or release carried spiritual as well as physical connotations, suggesting that disease was a binding or obstruction and healing a kind of freeing not only of tissue but of fate. Some sagas describe healers loosening the illness from the flesh, much like releasing a captive spirit, using incantations and herbal smoke to literally and metaphorically open pathways. The plants themselves were often anthropomorphized, described as generous, angry, shy, or potent healers would speak to them as partners rather than tools. In this way, herbal medicine in the Viking world was also a form of diplomacy between realms, a negotiation with the raw forces of life and death, which were never abstract but always personal, storied, and present. Certain plants were associated with specific gods or myths, further deepening their spiritual resonance. Meadowsweet, with its sweet fragrance and anti-inflammatory properties, was linked to peace and pleasure, often used to honor Freya or placed on altars during seasonal festivals. Birch sap, used as a tonic and purifier, was associated with renewal and rebirth, echoing the tree's symbolic role in Norse myth as a threshold between worlds. Garlic, believed to ward off spirits and purify the blood, was both food and defensa, protective boundary in culinary form. These plants existed at the intersection of nourishment, healing, and magic, their meanings layered through centuries of use and story. To gather, prepare, and administer them was to step into the flow of tradition and cosmic rhythm. And while modern medicine has largely compartmentalized disciplines, pharmacology here, psychology there, religion in another domain, Viking healing saw no such divisions. The mind, the body, the soul, and the world were one continuous landscape, shaped by will, intention, ritual, and respect for unseen forces. Healing in this context was not a matter of defeating illness, but of restoring wholeness, bringing the self back into harmony with the pulse of the land, the will of the gods, and the mysteries of fate. Even the healer's tools carried symbolic weight: wooden bowls carved with runes, ladles made from animal horn, cloths dyed with herbs, staffs topped with animal bones or feathers. Each object told a story. Each practice held meaning. Each session of healing was a reenactment of the great cosmological dramas that shaped Norse myth: the binding and unbinding of Loki, the loss and recovery of Balder, the cycles of destruction and rebirth foretold in Ragnarok. To heal someone, then, was to momentarily push back the entropy of the world, to enact a kind of mythic restoration on a human scale. This richness of meaning, this sacred pragmatism, reveals that Viking herbal medicine was more than an ancestral curiosity, was a full-bodied, sensical, culturally specific framework for understanding life, death, sickness, and the natural world. It reminds us that medicine is never just about molecules and outcomes. It is always shaped by worldview, language, and ritual. The Viking healer did not operate in a sterile laboratory, but in the charged spaces of forest glades, smoky hearths, storm-lashed cliffs, and communal longhouses, where every breath carried the echo of myth and every plant leaf shimmered with story. Their legacy inscribed not in manuscripts, but in oral poems, bone amulets, and whispered prayers challenges our modern assumptions about what constitutes valid medical knowledge, and invites us to imagine healing not as a fix, but as a reconnection to earth, to ancestors, to divinity, and to the wild. Enduring power of plants that know more than we think and offer more than we remember. In every bundle of mugwort, in every curl of burning juniper, in every spring drink of birch sap, There lies the ancient memory of a culture that healed not just through science, but through sacred attention, reminding us that medicine, its best, is not just a craft, but a covenant between the living and the world that sustains them. In the war-torn landscape of 15th century France, amid the smoldering wreckage of towns burned by English invaders and the growing desperation of a fractured kingdom, a young girl emerged from the obscurity of rural peasant life to forever alter the course of European history, not by bloodline, inheritance, or conquest, but through a claim so extraordinary and so unsettling that it would electrify the masses, terrify the elite, and ultimately reshape the religious and political imagination of a nation. Her name was Jeanne d'Arc. Joan of Arc, and her story illuminates with piercing clarity the volatile intersection of gender, faith, and power in the medieval world. Born in 1412 in the small village of Domremy, a humble hamlet on the shifting frontier between French and Burgundian-held territory, Joan was the daughter of tenant farmers, a girl without formal education, social status, or military training. She grew up in the shadow of the 100 Years' War, a brutal conflict between England and France that had drained both nations and plunged entire regions into chaos. By her early teens, she began reporting visions, voices of saints and angels, most notably Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret, commanding her to support the Dauphin, Charles VII, and to help drive the English from French soil. These claims, outrageous on their surface, were undergirded by an extraordinary conviction. And in a deeply religious age where divine will was believed to shape human affairs, Joan's prophetic certainty was not dismissed outright, even by powerful men. But it was precisely because she claimed access to divine authority without priestly intercession, and despite her gender, that she appended every normative expectation of what a woman could be in her time. In medieval society, women were expected to be silent, obedient, cloistered, and modest, their public roles confined to domestic service or religious devotion within narrow, controlled parameters. Joan, by contrast, donned male armor, cut her hair short, rode a warhorse, and addressed kings not as a supplicant, but as a prophetess with a mandate from heaven. This was more than unconventional. It was radical, and it struck at the heart of medieval social order. Her military leadership, which culminated in the lifting of the Siege of Orleans in 1429, a stunning reversal in a conflict that had long favored the English, was not merely a tactical success. It was a theological event, interpreted by many as a sign of divine favor for the French cause. Joan became a living symbol, a walking miracle, and her presence galvanized both troops and civilians alike. But that same symbol also unsettled the established authorities of church and state, who found in her not only inspiration, but danger. For if God could speak through an illiterate peasant girl, then what did that say about the legitimacy of kings, bishops, and noblemen? If divine will could be channeled outside clerical structures, what use were institutions? Joan's rise was thus not only a political anomaly, but a theological crisis. And her body became the battleground over which deeper questions of power, gender, and divine truth were fought. When she escorted Charles VII to Reims for his coronation, a symbolic affirmation of his legitimacy, her mission, at least in the eyes of heaven, was complete. But the earthly dangers of her position had only just begun. In 1430, she was captured by Burgundian forces, allies of the English, and sold to the English crown. They could not simply execute her as a prisoner of war. To do so would risk creating a martyr. Instead, they sought to destroy her through a trial, not just any trial, but an ecclesiastical inquisition held under the auspices of the Church, designed not merely to convict, but to discredit, humiliate, and erase her as a heretic and deceiver. This was not justice, but political theater cloaked in religious legitimacy. Her accusers, English-backed clergy and theologians, used canon law not as a means of discerning truth, but as an instrument of power, twisting Joan's piety into blasphemy, her visions into demonic delusions, and her cross-dressing into perversion. Central to their case was the issue of her attire, her wearing of male clothing, which they deemed a violation of biblical injunctions against gender transgression. Joan defended herself with startling clarity and theological precision, arguing that she wore men's clothing to preserve her modesty among soldiers, and that she did so at God's command. In her answers, we see a young woman barely 19 outwitting trained theologians, standing alone without counsel or protection, yet refusing to deny the visions that had defined her life. Her resistance revealed the trial for what it truly was: a politically motivated attempt to silence a woman whose power had never depended on hierarchy, wealth, or violence, but on charisma, conviction, and the belief that she had been chosen. When, after weeks of interrogation, deprivation, and threats, she was coerced into recanting her claims and was promised mercy in return, her captors considered the matter settled. But Joan, days later, withdrew her retraction, reaffirming her divine mission. It was this act, her refusal to betray her truth in the face of death, that sealed her fate. On May 30th, 1431, she was burned alive in the marketplace of Rouen, her ashes scattered in the Seine to prevent the collection of relics, her name anathematized by the very church she had once claimed to serve. And yet, death did not silence her. Within decades, her trial was revisited, her conviction annulled, and her name cleared. In 1456, a posthumous retrial declared her innocent, recognizing that she had been the victim of political manipulation, masquerading as spiritual judgment. Over the centuries, Joan's legend only grew. Canonized as a saint in 1920, she became not only a figure of Catholic piety, but a symbol of French national identity, feminist resistance, and spiritual conviction. Her story has been told in sermons, plays, novels, films, and songs, each iteration refracting her legacy through the lens of new cultural values. She has been invoked by monarchists and replicants, Catholics and secularists, feminists and traditionalists alike, each seeking in her a reflection of their ideals. Yet at the core of her enduring legacy lies the same elemental tension: the confrontation between individual conscience and institutional power, between lived experience and doctrinal authority, between a young woman's faith and a world unprepared. For it, her gender was not incidental to her story, it was central. In breaking the bounds of what was considered acceptable for a woman leading armies, interpreting divine will, defying male authority, Joan revealed the artificiality of those bounds. She did not merely transgress social roles. She shattered the illusion that such roles were natural, inevitable, or divinely ordained. Her visions gave her the authority to act in a world where women were expected to submit. And by acting on those visions, she exposed the cracks in the medieval edifice where faith could empower, but also be used to destroy. In Joan's life and death, we see both the liberating and the perilous potential of religious experience, especially when that experience challenges the political and gendered hierarchies of its time. Her trial was not merely a heresy proceeding, was a crucible for an entire society's anxieties about order, gender, and control. Her judges could not tolerate the idea that a peasant girl might hold more spiritual authority than bishops. Her executioners feared the way she inspired loyalty beyond the bounds of feudal allegiance. Her enemies hated her not only for her victories, but for the unsettling truth she represented: that power does not always come from title, and that legitimacy can be born from belief. In the centuries since, Joan's story has remained powerfully resonant precisely because it speaks to universal themes: the courage to follow one's convictions, the price of challenging systems of oppression, the complexity of female leadership, and the ways in which personal faith can both uplift and endanger. Her canonization, nearly 500 years after her death, marked not just a religious recognition, but a cultural reckoning, a belated acknowledgement that what was once condemned as heresy could become sanctity when seen in a different light. And this transformation itself underscores the mutability of history and the power of individual narrative to shape collective memory. Joan's life has become a mirror in which each generation sees its struggles and aspirations reflected. But perhaps her most enduring lesson is this: that courage is not the absence of fear, but the defiance of it. That belief, however personal, can challenge empires, and that a single voice, even when trembling, can alter the course of nations. Joan of Arc remains, across the span of 6 centuries, a figure who defies easy categorization: a warrior mystic, a teenage prophet, a martyr, a national icon, a woman who spoke with the certainty of divine purpose in a world that had no place for her. And yet, by stepping into that world, by insisting on her truth, and by holding to it even unto death, she forced that world to change. Her ashes were cast to the river, but her name took root in the imagination of a continent. And in that paradox of erasure followed by remembrance, of silence followed by song, we see the enduring power of Joan of Arc, a flame that could not be extinguished, a voice that still speaks, and a legacy that continues to challenge the boundaries of gender, faith, and power with every telling. In the heart of every medieval town or village, where stone walls held back the chaos of war, famine, and plague, and church bells marked the hours with divine certainty, there stood a structure more humble but no less essential to the rhythms of daily life: the bakery, a place where coarse flour and simple water, leavened by air and fire, were transformed into the most vital substance of the European diet: bread. It is difficult, from the vantage point of the modern world, where grocery store shelves groan with abundance and digital commerce delivers luxuries in hours, to fully grasp just how central bread was to medieval existence, not just nutritionally, but politically, spiritually, economically, and socially. Bread was not a food among many. It was the food, the cornerstone of survival, and the daily measure of justice and fairness for peasants, townsfolk, and even kings. And at the center of this vast, invisible system of nourishment and trust stood the baker, a figure both ordinary and indispensable, whose work sustained more than hunger, maintained the very fabric of the medieval world. From the 11th to the 15th centuries, across the cities of Christendom and into the countryside, the baker was not merely an artisan, but a public servant in all but name, one whose actions were regulated by an intricate web of guild statutes, municipal decrees, market customs, and religious obligations. Bakers operated under an extraordinary degree of scrutiny, not because they were suspected of corruption by default, but because the stakes were simply too high. If bread was mispriced, adulterated, hoarded, or in short supply, entire neighborhoods could descend into chaos. Hunger was not just an individual affliction in the Middle Ages, it was a spark waiting to ignite public disorder. A shortage of bread or a sudden hike in prices could lead to food riots, looting, and attacks on bakeries, often culminating in swift and brutal retribution by local authorities. Thus, the regulation of bread was nothing less than a mechanism of social control, a delicate balancing act between supply and demand, subsistence and profit, trust and transparency. The rules governing the baker's craft were extensive and exacting. In cities like London, Paris, Florence, and Lubeck, bread production was policed by official laws that fixed the price and weight of loaves according to the current market price of grain. A fluctuation in grain supply due to a poor harvest war or disrupted trade route would not result in fluctuating bread prices as it might today. Rather, the size and weight of the loaf were adjusted to preserve affordability. This was a medieval solution to the universal problem of food justice, the belief that the poor must never be priced out of their daily bread, even in hard times. Bakers who failed to meet these standards could be fined, publicly shamed, or worse. In England, the infamous pillory awaited those found guilty of short-weight loaves. Offenders were locked into wooden stocks in a public square with their underweight bread nailed beside them, a literal display of broken trust. In some cases, repeat offenders were banished or subjected to more severe corporal punishments. The regulation of bread was thus both technical and theatrical, an effort not only to enforce standards, but to display accountability, reassuring a nervous populace that their staple food was in safe, honest hands. But the bakers themselves were not simply passive recipients of oversight. They organized into guilds, powerful economic and social bodies that governed admission to the profession, regulated training through apprenticeships, set internal quality standards, and defended their members in legal or political disputes. These guilds were not just trade unions. They were civic institutions, often connected to religious confraternities, responsible for sponsoring feast days, maintaining altars, and distributing alms. The Bakers' Guild might help build a church, feed the poor during Lent, or ensure that widows and orphans of guild members were provided for. This blending of profession and piety reinforced the idea that baking was not merely a craft, but a calling, one entrusted with the literal and moral sustenance of the community. To bake bread, then, was to participate in a sacred chain of production, stretching from divine creation to human need. The baker received grain, a gift of the earth, born of sunlight, soil, and seasonal luck, ground into flour by the miller, mixed with water and yeast, kneaded by hand, and finally shaped into loaves to be baked in cavernous brick ovens, whose fires were tended from dawn until dusk. The smell of bread, wafting through narrow, cobbled streets, was the smell of life renewed each morning. And in that sensory ritual lay a kind of covenant. The baker would provide sustenance. The community would provide trust, and both would honor the fragile peace that held civilization together. But that peace was always precarious. In times of shortage, bakers were accused of hiding flour, of adulterating dough with sawdust or ground beans, or of colluding with millers and grain merchants to manipulate prices. These accusations, whether true or not, reflected deeper anxieties about power, scarcity, and survival. Bread, unlike luxury goods, could not be hoarded without consequence, was too central to the poor man's diet. A laborer might spend up to 70% of his daily income on bread alone. When it disappeared or became unaffordable, the social contract itself seemed to dissolve. As a result, bakers often bore the brunt of public anger in times of economic distress, and their position at the intersection of market forces and public need made them a kind of early bellwether of civil unrest. Indeed, medieval chroniclers noted that food riots were often the earliest signs of political instability, and bakeries the first places to fall when mobs rose. Yet despite the risks, or perhaps because of them, the profession remained vital and respected. Many bakers were prosperous, owning property, employing apprentices, and participating in local governance. Women also played crucial roles, especially in rural or domestic contexts where baking was often a family affair. In some towns, women formed their own baking guilds or held specific privileges within mixed-gender organizations. While they rarely held leadership roles, their labor was essential to maintaining supply, particularly during holy seasons or market days when demand surged. And it was not only how bread was made that mattered, but what kind. Bread existed on a spectrum of class and meaning. The rich ate manchet, a fine white bread made from sifted flour and baked to perfect roundness, while the poor subsisted on coarse black bread made from rye or barley, dense and sour, often baked with husks. Still in, the very texture of bread signaled one's place in the social order. In monasteries and cathedrals, bread took on a spiritual role, transformed into the body of Christ in the Eucharist, distributed as alms, and offered as votive gifts. In royal courts, it was served gilded or spiced, symbolic of wealth and refinement. And yet, Regardless of variety, bread was universal, its ubiquity a reminder of shared dependence. The baker, standing behind his counter or loading loaves into baskets for delivery, became a daily presence in the life of his community, less visible than the priest or the Lord, but perhaps more essential. For when the bells rang at dawn, and the town stirred awake, it was the scent of fresh bread that welcomed the new day. And in that scent, people found not only nourishment, but reassurance that the ovens were lit, the order held, and life could continue. The symbolic power of bread extended even into law and literature. It appeared in contracts, oaths, and curses. Breaking bread with someone implied trust. Withholding bread, betrayal. The Bible's language of daily bread resonated deeply in a world where food security could not be taken for granted. Medieval moralists warned against wasting bread, treating it as a sin to throw away crusts or trample crumbs. Even in death, bread followed the soul. Loaves were given at funerals, laid on altars for the dead, or distributed to the poor in the name of the deceased. To be a baker was to serve not only the living, but the memory of the dead and the hope of the future. In this way, the baker's work transcended mere sustenance. It became a form of stewardship of bodies, yes, but also of stability, trust, and spiritual continuity. And as long as the bread flowed from oven to table, society endured. But if the ovens went cold or the loaves grew thin, the cracks in the social order were felt immediately, viscerally, and often violently. The history of medieval bread, then, is not just a culinary tale, it is a story of governance, labor, ritual, and survival. It reminds us that food is never just food, it is politics, morality, and meaning. And those who produced it, the bakers of the Middle Ages, were not simply tradespeople, they were the quiet custodians of peace, the keepers of daily ritual, and the guardians of the most elemental social bond, the promise that come morning there would be bread enough for all. For all. In the world of medieval Europe, where rigid social hierarchies and gender norms shaped daily life with uncompromising clarity, and where male-dominated guilds and church teachings often reinforced a patriarchal vision of labor and legitimacy, the kitchen hearth and the commercial bakehouse emerged as spaces where the boundaries between domestic duty and economic participation were not only blurred, but actively contested. And at the heart of these spaces, measured in flour-dusted hands and pre-dawn labor, stood women whose contributions to one of the most essential and symbolically charged trades of the era, baking, were both indispensable and persistently under-recognized. In an age when bread was not a convenience but a lifeline, forming the caloric foundation of nearly every meal across classes and regions, the production of that bread was far more than routine. It was a critical act of sustenance, a moral and social obligation, and a highly politicized craft. And although medieval baking guilds, particularly in urban centers, were formally controlled by men who held legal rights to bake for sale, determined membership through apprenticeships, regulated standards, and negotiated prices with civic authorities, the reality of daily baking, both inside the home and in commercial production, reveals a much more complex and inclusive picture. One in which women were not passive bystanders, but active practitioners, inheritors of knowledge, transmitters of skill, and sometimes, remarkably, business owners who navigated both the bread economy and the gendered expectations of their time with intelligence, resilience, and quiet authority. In countless rural homes and urban households, women baked bread daily as a core domestic responsibility, often using communal ovens, which were shared among neighbors and managed cooperatively within villages or town parishes. Here, baking was a social act tied to seasonal rhythms, religious obligations, and familial survival. A woman who mastered fermentation, kneading, and baking was not only fulfilling her expected role as housekeeper and caregiver, she was ensuring that her family had food in times of scarcity. That surplus grain was not wasted, and that sacred rhythms like Lent, Easter, and saints' feast days were observed with the proper ceremonial loaves and holy buns. These acts, repeated endlessly and often invisibly, were the foundation of community stability. Yet beyond the walls of the home, women also participated in the commercial sphere of baking, sometimes in legally sanctioned ways, and at other times by navigating legal gray zones. Widows, in particular, often inherited their husbands' bakeries and continued to run them. Medieval customary law in many regions permitted women to retain a deceased spouse's business, especially if they had already worked alongside him. In such cases, a woman might take on apprentices, manage accounts, purchase flour and fuel, and negotiate prices with city officials or clients, performing all the roles of a male guild member, without ever being granted official recognition. These women were simultaneously exceptions and pillars of the system, holding together bakeries that employed entire households or fed entire parishes, while navigating legal codes that barely acknowledged their existence. In places like Paris, London, and Lubeck, records show women bakers paying guild dues, appearing in court for trade disputes, and even facing punishment for short-weight loaves, indicating not only participation but accountability. Some women operated independently, others in partnership with male relatives, and still others in networks of female labor that included daughters, servants, and hired kneaders. In market towns, women sometimes sold bread they had baked themselves, or purchased wholesale from larger operations, acting as retailers who brought baked goods to public squares and neighborhood streets. These bread sellers, often called hucksters or regraders, were recreators who accused them of price gouging or unfair competition, but they also fulfilled a vital role in feeding the urban poor and delivering food to those unable to bake themselves. Whether seen as domestic producers, commercial entrepreneurs, or market intermediaries, medieval women in baking roles traversed and reshaped the boundaries between home and economy. Their labor was not neatly confined to one realm or another. It was inherently hybrid, an economic necessity wrapped in domestic expectation. In this way, medieval baking becomes a lens through which to challenge simplified narratives of gendered labor division. It reveals a world where women's work, while often unrecorded in guild charters or civic ledgers, was deeply embedded in the survival and sustenance of communities. The knowledge they held about yeast cultures, flour consistency, oven temperatures, and dough hydration was not considered science, and yet it required tremendous skill, attention, and experience. This knowledge was passed down informally across generations through practice and repetition, forming a female knowledge tradition that paralleled and sometimes rivaled the formal training systems of guild apprenticeships. And though many women were barred from full guild membership, some urban centers allowed femmes, souls legally independent women, often widows or unmarried women of means, to operate licensed bakehouses or stalls. In cities like London, women were regularly recorded as baking for institutions such as monasteries or hospitals, or as suppliers for local lords and wealthy households. In such roles, they could earn respectable income, gain access to markets, and even acquire social standing. And yet, the fact that their work was so often coded as helping, assisting, or informal reveals the deep gender biases that shaped medieval records and obscured female labor. To call a woman an assistant in a bakehouse she managed, or to label her as unofficial despite years of technical expertise, was not just a bureaucratic oversight, was an ideological erasure, a reflection of the broader medieval discomfort with female economic agency. But despite these obstacles, women persisted, and their impact was substantial. In the countryside, particularly during the lean months of late winter and early spring, women's ability to stretch flour supplies, create nutrient-dense loaves with peas or beans, and bake with wild yeast when commercial leavening failed often meant the difference between hunger and survival. In cities, they diversified the types of bread offered, experimenting with spices, seeds, and dried fruits, especially for feast days or elite clients. They also played central roles in the religious dimensions of baking, producing Panis Benedictus blessed bread, soul cakes for All Souls' Day, and communion wafers, forms of bread imbued with spiritual meaning, reinforcing the sacredness of their craft. And beyond the kitchen, women organized. In some cases, they formed informal collectives to share oven time, pool flour purchases, or co-manage sales routes. There is evidence of disputes between women, bakers, and male guild members over access to oven space or market stalls, disputes that testify to their active presence and commercial stakes. Women also challenged unjust regulations through petitions or legal appeals, asserting their right to participate in the bread economy and claiming expertise that guilds sometimes denied them. Their ability to operate in these contested spaces to be both homemaker and breadwinner, both religious servant and commercial actor, underscores their flexibility and resilience in a social system that frequently tried to contain them. Their work was not just economically necessary, it was culturally formative. The act of baking, repeated daily by millions of women across centuries, shaped the collective sensory memory of medieval Europe. The smell of fresh loaves in the morning, the warmth of bread shared at meals, the comfort of a mother's hands, shaping dough, the nourishment of a wife's labor transformed into food. These were not incidental acts, they were the texture of life itself. And yet this labor was so constant, so embedded, that it often went unnoticed by chroniclers, overshadowed by battles, coronations, and male-dominated institutions. To recover the story of women bakers is thus to recover the story of medieval life at its most intimate and essential. It is to see that power was not only wielded in castles and cathedrals, but also in kitchens and bakehouses. That agency was not only political or military, but domestic and nutritional. That women, through the daily act of transforming grain into bread, were not simply feeding their families, they were sustaining economies, shaping communities, and negotiating complex roles within a world that needed their labor but struggled to name it. Their story complicates the image of the medieval woman as cloistered, passive, or peripheral. It reveals instead a portrait of industrious, adaptive, often entrepreneurial individuals who inhabited the seams of official structures and made those structures function. And while few women bakers' names survive in the annals of medieval history, their legacy endures in the traditions they maintained, the communities they supported, and the loaves they bake teach one a quiet act of survival, nourishment, and strength. In every hearth that glowed before sunrise, in every kneaded lump of rye or wheat, in every shared crust or holy bun offered to the poor, we glimpse the unrecorded labor of medieval women whose work quite literally held their world together. And in honoring their role, we not only rewrite the narrative of medieval labor, we recognize that behind every stable society, there are often the unseen hands of women who baked the bread that kept it alive. As we step back from the intimate portraits drawn across the arc of this exploration, snapshots of Roman brothels shadowed by empire, Viking longhouses where herbs met the gods, medieval battlefields and courtrooms echoing with the teenage girls' voice, and bustling bakehouses lit before dawn by the glow of communal ovens, we find ourselves looking not at 4 isolated episodes in the great sweep of human history, but at a tightly interwoven tapestry of resilience, adaptation, belief, and labor, told not through the polished statues of emperors or the thrones of kings, but through the quiet and often silenced voices of those who lived at the edges of written memory. These stories of Roman prostitutes, Viking healers, Joan of Arc, and medieval bakers are not footnotes in grand chronicles, but living windows into the social, spiritual, and political dynamics that truly held ancient and medieval societies together. They remind us that history, for all its conquests and coronations, is not merely the legacy of power, but the sum of human experience. It is found in the cramped quarters above Roman taverns, where women whose names are lost nevertheless carved their identities into plaster with wit, resilience, and economic salve, navigating a city that simultaneously demanded and despised them, surviving through sharp business instincts, coded signals, and sacred amulets, transforming marginalization into adaptation and branding into survival. It is found in the forests and fields of Viking Scandinavia, where healing was not a mechanistic craft but a ritual act, performed with hands that gathered mugwort and yarrow as offerings as much as medicines, invoking the cosmological order of gods and spirits as part of the curing process, and where women keepers of oral knowledge and spiritual power held the balance between life and death, not in written scrolls, but in memory, song, and sacred breath. It is found in the determined stride of a teenage peasant girl from Domremy, who heard voices not just in dreams but in defiance of a world that told her to be silent, and who rose not by birthright or patronage but by conviction, leading armies, challenging kings, and exposing, through her capture and trial, the brittle machinery of a society that feared what it could not control, especially when it came in the form of a woman armed not with a sword but a vision. And it is found in the flower-streaked arms of countless unnamed bakersmen and women, freemen and widows who each day converted grain into sustenance under the gaze of guildmasters and the expectations of a hungry public, where a loaf to light could incite unrest and a loaf to dear could trigger revolt. In their hands, bread was never just food. It was trust, it was justice, it was the social contract in edible form. And among these hands, we find women under-acknowledged, yet essentially whose baking straddled home and market, ritual and economy, whose labor was constant, unrecorded, and foundational to the communities that depended on them. These individuals, prostitutes, healers, saints, bakers may seem to occupy disparate corners of time and space, but their stories intersect in powerful ways. They reveal how society draws lines between visibility and invisibility, between power and powerlessness, between the sanctioned and the subversive. They show us how laws, customs, and hierarchies attempt to fix people into roles, yet how people, in turn, resist, reshape, and redefine those roles through daily acts of courage, faith, and creativity. The Roman sex worker marked by the female toga is not just a symbol of state-imposed stigma, but also of economic ingenuity in a marketplace of bodies and branding. The Viking series treating wounds with herbal smoke is not merely a relic of superstition, but a reminder of a worldview where health was relational, ritualistic, and sacred. Joan of Arc, burned to silence her voice, becomes louder with each retelling, her memory challenging every generation to reconsider what it means to speak truth from the margins. The medieval baker, scraping dough at dawn under guild pressure and public scrutiny, becomes a metaphor for the invisible labor that upholds not only bellies, but societies. What unites these lives is their tension with systems, legal, religious, economic, that sought to contain them. But what emerges is not submission, but negotiation. The Roman woman who uses graffiti to manage her reputation, the healer who balances prayer and poultice, the girl who calls herself God's messenger, the widow who reopens the bakery's doors and feeds the parish. These are not victims of history. They are its agents. They remind us that beneath the banners of kings and the marble monuments of generals, history is lived and often endured by those whose stories are scratched into walls, whispered in ritual, sung in fields, or baked into crusts. Their worlds were precarious and often perilous, but they were never passive. Their lives reveal how deeply the personal was always political, how the spiritual could be weaponized or redemptive, how labor was not just economic activity, but identity, and how gender shaped access to all of it. Their stories do not merely add color to history, they complicate it. They challenge the clean lines of textbook categories and force us to see that the forces shaping civilizations are not only those of war, diplomacy, and law, but also of care, conviction, and bread. In Roman brothels, Viking healing circles, French battlefields, and medieval bakehouses, we find people who worked with what they had, often to little, and still managed to craft lives, communities, and legacies. They were judged by systems they did not build, punished by laws that denied their voice, and remembered diff at all through the distortions of later scribes. And yet, through the fragments they left behind, they speak. In doing so, they reveal the true depth of history, not just the record of the powerful, but the memory of the many. These lives ask us to rethink what counts as history. They ask us to look beyond the epic and the heroic, to consider that the shaping of society happens not just in palaces and councils, but in alleys and kitchens, sickbeds and marketplaces. They ask us to recognize that marginalized does not mean powerless, that overlooked does not mean irrelevant, and that forgotten does not mean unimportant. The prostitute with a chalked price and a whispered prayer. The healer who speaks to roots and gods. The girl with armor and a divine mission. The woman who needs dough into daily survival. All of them are history, not in its margins, but at its very core. And as we gather their stories half buried in ruins, hinted at in court records, immortalized in fire or in flower, we are reminded that to study the past is not simply to chart progress or decline, but to engage in empathy. To see how others lived, resisted, and believed in times as uncertain as our own. In their resilience, we see models of adaptation. In their rituals, echoes of belief. In their work, the scaffolding of society. These were not the rulers of their age, but they were its makers. And perhaps, in listening closely to their lives, we learn not only about them, but about ourselves. For in the end, history is not a monument, it is a living field of memory, seated by millions of hands, many of them anonymous, many of them female, many of them told here, at last, not as curiosities, but as subjects worthy of reflection, respect, and recognition. And in that reflection, we discover that what binds these stories of sex, of healing, of faith, of food, is not just that they come from the past, but that they illuminate the enduring present, the complexity of human identity, the power of belief, the necessity of labor, and the unbreakable link between those who make history and those who remember it.